You're standing in a rice paddy in southern China. It's August 1945. The war is over, but nobody told the men with rifles pointed at your chest. You're one of 22 Marines. There are over 100 enemy soldiers surrounding you. Your radio is dead. Your commanding officer is 300 miles away. The nearest American unit could be anywhere. And in about 30 seconds, someone is going to have to decide whether this ends in a firefight or a handshake. This is the story of the most surreal, least discussed battlefield encounter of the Pacific War. It's not about heroism in the way training manuals describe it. It's about nerve, improvisation, cultural miscommunication, and the razor-thin psychological line between combat and surrender when nobody is entirely sure the war is actually over. By August 1945, the war in the Pacific had contracted into a series of isolated pockets, desperate last stands, and chaotic transitional moments where the machinery of war hadn't yet caught up with political reality. While historians focus on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the surrender aboard the USS Missouri, thousands of smaller dramas unfolded across China, Indochina, and the Pacific Islands, where Japanese garrisons received contradictory orders, communications broke down, and Allied forces found themselves in situations doctrine had never prepared them for. China was a labyrinth. The Japanese occupation had fragmented into regional commands, each operating with varying degrees of loyalty to Tokyo, varying levels of supply, and wildly different interpretations of Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15th. Some units laid down their arms immediately. Others fortified their positions and waited. A few fought on, either out of defiance, disbelief, or simple isolation from reliable information. And in the mountains and valleys of southern China, where nationalist forces, communist guerrillas, collaborationist militias, and Imperial Japanese Army remnants all occupied overlapping territories, the concept of a clean surrender was almost laughable. The United States Marine Corps had a presence in China that most Americans never learned about in school. They weren't there to invade. They were there to secure key locations, protect American personnel, oversee Japanese disarmament, and prevent the collapse of order in the power vacuum that would inevitably follow Japan's defeat. It was occupation duty before the occupation had been formalized. It was peacekeeping in a country still at war with itself. And for the men on the ground, it meant walking into situations where the rules kept changing and nobody could tell you who was in charge. One of those situations unfolded in a rural district southwest of Guangzhou, in terrain that barely appeared on American maps. The unit involved was a Marine Reconnaissance Detachment, lightly armed, tasked with establishing contact with a reported Japanese garrison and confirming their willingness to surrender under the terms announced 2 weeks earlier. 22 men, standard infantry loadout, no armor, no air support, and a translator who spoke textbook Japanese but had never spoken to an actual Japanese soldier. They were expecting a formality. They got something else entirely. The detachment moved out at dawn. The landscape was a patchwork of flooded rice fields, low hills covered in dense vegetation, and narrow dirt roads that turned to mud under the late summer rains. Intelligence reports suggested the garrison was a depleted infantry company, perhaps 60 men, stationed at an old administrative building that had served as a district tax office before the war. The Japanese had been using it as a supply depot and regional command post. Radio intercepts indicated they had received Tokyo's surrender order, but there had been no confirmation of compliance, no white flags, no contact with Chinese nationalist forces in the area. The Marines moved cautiously. The war might be over on paper, but muscle memory doesn't evaporate overnight. Every tree line was a potential ambush. Every quiet village was a coin toss between cooperation and concealed hostility. The men kept their rifles ready, eyes scanning, moving in the loose tactical formation they'd drilled into reflex during months of island fighting in the Marianas and Okinawa. But there was something different in the air now. A hesitancy, a strange cognitive dissonance that comes from preparing to kill someone you've been told has already surrendered. The translator, a second-generation Japanese-American sergeant from California, had spent the entire war in intelligence roles, never closer to combat than a radio tent. He carried a printed copy of the surrender terms, translated into formal Japanese, folded in his breast pocket. He had rehearsed the phrases. He had practiced the tone, the posture, the etiquette required when addressing Japanese officers who still believed in concepts like honor and face. He had read reports about how delicate these encounters could be, how a misunderstood gesture or an unintentionally insulting word choice could turn a negotiation into a bloodbath. He had not been prepared for what they found when they crested the hill overlooking the tax office. There were over 100 Japanese soldiers standing in formation in the courtyard. Not 60. Not a depleted company. A fully assembled, disciplined, armed unit, standing at attention in neat ranks, rifles stacked beside them in precise triangular clusters, officers at the front, flags still flying. The Marine lieutenant froze. His radio operator immediately tried to raise headquarters. Static. The mountains played hell with their short-range sets, and the relay station they'd passed 2 hours ago was at the edge of effective range. They were alone, 22 men staring down at more than 100, and those 100 had seen them. You don't train for this. There's no manual that tells you how to proceed when you are outnumbered 5-1. Your enemy is organized and armed, and you're supposed to accept their surrender despite having no tactical advantage whatsoever. The textbook answer is to withdraw, regroup, and return with overwhelming force. But the textbook doesn't account for pride. It doesn't account for the fact that if you turn around now, you look weak. And in a culture where weakness invites attack, perception becomes reality. The Japanese officers were watching. One of them, a captain judging by his uniform, stepped forward and raised his hand in what could have been a signal to halt or a signal to open fire. The Marines couldn't tell. The lieutenant had to make a decision. He could order his men to take cover, pull back to a defensible position, and wait for reinforcements that might not arrive for hours or days. Or he could walk down that hill, into that courtyard, and bet everything on the assumption that the war really was over and that these soldiers actually wanted to surrender. He chose the second option. He told his men to lower their rifles, keep their hands visible, and follow him down the slope. The translator went white. One of the Marines, a corporal from Tennessee, muttered something about this being the dumbest thing he'd ever been ordered to do. But they followed. Because that's what you do. This content is only supported in a Lark Docs. The walk down felt longer than it was. Every step carried the weight of catastrophic miscalculation. If the Japanese opened fire, the Marines would be cut down in the open before they could return effective fire. If this was a trap, a ruse to lure them into close range, it was brilliantly executed. But if it wasn't, if this was a genuine attempt to surrender with some semblance of dignity and order, then running away would insult that attempt and potentially turn a peaceful handover into a face-saving firefight. The lieutenant reached the courtyard gate. The Japanese captain stepped forward to meet him. They stood 3 feet apart. Neither saluted. The translator, shaking slightly, moved beside the lieutenant and began speaking in formal Japanese, introducing the Marine unit, referencing the Emperor's declaration, and requesting confirmation that the garrison intended to comply with surrender terms. The captain listened. His face was unreadable. Behind him, the assembled soldiers remained motionless. The silence stretched. The Marines behind the lieutenant tightened their grips on their rifles, still lowered, but ready to snap up if this went wrong. The heat was suffocating. The air smelled like wet earth and gun oil. Then the captain bowed. Not deeply, but enough. He responded in clipped, precise Japanese. The translator struggled to keep up, his own Japanese suddenly feeling inadequate, but the meaning was clear. The garrison had received the surrender order. They had debated it for 3 days. Some officers had advocated for continued resistance. Others had argued for suicide rather than capitulation. But the captain had made the final decision. They would surrender, but only to Americans, not to Chinese forces, not to communist guerrillas, and only if the process was conducted with respect. The lieutenant didn't speak Japanese, but he understood leverage when he saw it. These soldiers were terrified of what would happen if they surrendered to the Chinese, nationalist, or communist. Atrocities were currency in this part of China. Every side had committed them. Japanese soldiers captured by Chinese forces often didn't survive long enough to reach a POW camp. The Americans represented the only option that didn't guarantee torture or execution. But the Japanese captain had his own fear. If he surrendered to a force that couldn't control the handover, if local Chinese forces arrived and demanded the prisoners before they could be transferred to American custody, his men would be slaughtered. He needed assurance. He needed proof that these 22 Marines could actually protect them. The lieutenant had no such assurance. He had no backup, no reinforcements, no orders covering this scenario. He had his men, his sidearm, and a translator who looked like he might pass out. But he lied. Calmly, convincingly, through the translator. He told the captain that a larger American force was en route, that this detachment was the advance party, and that full custody would be established within hours. He promised that no Chinese forces would be allowed to take custody until the prisoners were processed by American command. It was a complete fabrication, but it was delivered with such confidence, such unwavering eye contact, that the captain believed it, or chose to believe it, or decided that belief was preferable to the alternative. The captain gave orders. The Japanese soldiers began disassembling their weapon stacks. They placed rifles, pistols, grenades, and swords in organized piles in the center of the courtyard. They moved with mechanical precision, as if this were a drill. The Marines watched, still outnumbered, still surrounded, as over 100 enemy combatants systematically disarmed themselves based on nothing more than a bluff and a promise. Once the weapons were collected, the real problem began. The Marines now had custody of more than 100 prisoners with no means to transport them, no secure facility to hold them, and no communication with higher command. The Japanese soldiers sat in formation in the courtyard, orderly and quiet, waiting for the American reinforcements that didn't exist. The lieutenant sent 2 Marines back up the hill to find high ground and try to establish radio contact. The rest formed a perimeter, not around the prisoners, but around the compound, to prevent anyone else from wandering into this surreal standoff. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The heat became unbearable. The Japanese soldiers didn't move. They didn't speak. They sat in perfect rows, hands visible, eyes forward, as if stillness could somehow impose order on the chaos of their situation. A few of them were visibly young, teenagers conscripted late in the war, boys who had probably never seen combat. Others were older, career soldiers with ribbons and scars, men who had fought in Manchuria, China, and perhaps the Philippines. All of them wore the same expression of exhausted resignation. The Marines didn't know what to do with them. You can't guard 100 men with 22. You can't march them anywhere. You can't process them. You can't feed them. One of the Marines, a private from Iowa, asked the lieutenant what they were supposed to do if the prisoners decided they'd made a mistake and wanted their weapons back. The lieutenant didn't have an answer. The translator sat down beside the Japanese captain and attempted conversation. Slowly, haltingly, he learned details. The garrison had been cut off from regular supply for 2 months. They were down to quarter rations. Several men had malaria, others had dysentery. They had buried 11 soldiers in the past month, none from combat, all from disease or starvation. They had stopped receiving orders from higher command in mid-July. The surrender broadcast had reached them via a local collaborator who still had a working radio. They had spent 3 days verifying it, trying to confirm through other channels that it wasn't a trick or Allied propaganda. When confirmation came, the debate began. Some officers wanted to retreat into the mountains and continue guerrilla resistance. Others wanted to march to the coast and attempt evacuation. The captain had argued for surrender because he believed it was the only option that gave his men a chance to survive. He had been overruled by 2 other officers. There had been a confrontation. The captain had drawn his sword. The other officers had backed down. It wasn't a mutiny. It was a coup against a plan that would have killed everyone. The captain had taken control, made the decision, and now, bore the responsibility. If the surrender failed, if the Chinese arrived first, if the Americans couldn't deliver on their promise, it would be his failure, his dishonor, his men's deaths. The translator relayed this to the lieutenant. The lieutenant, a 24-year-old from Ohio who had been commissioned 18 months earlier, realized he was sitting on a powder keg. These soldiers had surrendered because they trusted him. If he couldn't deliver, if Chinese forces arrived and demanded custody, he would have to choose between starting a firefight to protect enemy prisoners or breaking his word and letting them be taken. Neither option was acceptable. He made another decision. He told the translator to explain to the captain that they would all wait together until proper American authority arrived, no matter how long it took. He told his men to share their rations with the prisoners. He ordered the Japanese medic to treat the sick and wounded using the Marines' medical supplies. He wasn't following doctrine. He was following instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through Saipan and Iwo Jima. When you make a promise to someone who has disarmed themselves because of that promise, you honor it, even if it's inconvenient, even if it's dangerous, because the moment you don't, you lose the only thing keeping everyone alive. This content is only supported in a Lark Docs. It took until late afternoon for the radio Marines to make contact. The message was garbled, but they managed to relay coordinates, situation, and a request for immediate support. The response was delayed. Headquarters initially didn't believe the report. 22 Marines had taken custody of over 100 Japanese prisoners with no resistance. It sounded like a fabrication or a miscount. They requested confirmation. The radio operator repeated the message, adding details about the garrison's condition and the fragile nature of the surrender. This time, headquarters took it seriously. By nightfall, a convoy arrived. 2 trucks, a jeep, and 30 additional Marines, along with an intelligence officer who outranked everyone on site. The lieutenant gave his report, expecting to be relieved or reprimanded. Instead, the intelligence officer shook his hand and told him he just pulled off one of the strangest, cleanest surrenders in the entire China theater. The prisoners were loaded into trucks. The Japanese captain, before boarding, approached the lieutenant and bowed deeply. He said something in Japanese. The translator explained. He was thanking the lieutenant for keeping his word. He was acknowledging that the lieutenant had shown more honor in 6 hours than he had seen in 6 years of war. The lieutenant didn't know how to respond. He nodded. The captain climbed into the truck. The convoy pulled away. The Marines who had spent the day holding an impossible position were left standing in an empty courtyard, surrounded by stacked weapons and the strange, deflating feeling that comes after tension breaks and adrenaline fades. The prisoners were processed, transferred to a larger POW facility, and eventually repatriated to Japan during the occupation. The Japanese captain survived the war, returned home, and lived quietly until his death in the 1970s. None of the Marines were decorated for the incident. It didn't fit the narrative of heroic combat. It was too strange, too informal, too dependent on bluffing and improvisation to be held up as an example of military excellence. The after-action report noted the successful disarmament and transfer of enemy combatants, but didn't elaborate on the precariousness of the situation or the gamble that made it possible. But among the men who were there, the story became legend, not because they had fought and won, but because they had convinced an armed, desperate enemy force to surrender without firing a shot, held them for hours with no support, and delivered on a promise that should have been impossible to keep. It was a battlefield victory that looked nothing like what anyone imagined victory would look like. War is usually remembered through the lens of decisive battles, grand strategies, and clear moral lines. But most of war is improvisation. It's negotiating terms with an enemy who doesn't trust you and shouldn't trust you but has no better option. It's making promises you can't guarantee and delivering on them anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. It's 22 men walking into a courtyard full of armed soldiers and betting everything on the belief that even enemies can recognize when the fight is over. What happened in that courtyard reveals something fundamental about the end of wars. Surrender is not a mechanical process. It's not the flipping of a switch where one side lays down arms and the other takes custody. Surrender is a psychological negotiation between two groups of people who have been trained to kill each other, now forced to trust each other at the exact moment when trust is most difficult. The Japanese soldiers in that garrison had been indoctrinated for years with the belief that surrender was disgrace, that capture meant torture, that death was preferable to capitulation. Yet they surrendered, not because they suddenly stopped believing those things, but because they were offered an alternative narrative. Surrender to the Americans, who might treat prisoners according to international law, rather than surrender to Chinese forces, who had every reason not to. The Marines faced their own psychological barrier. They had spent years fighting an enemy portrayed as fanatical, suicidal, and incapable of rational surrender. The entire Pacific War had been characterized by brutal combat, last-stand defenses, and the rarity of mass surrenders. To walk into a situation where a Japanese garrison wanted to surrender, peacefully and with dignity, required a cognitive shift that most of them weren't prepared for. The war had taught them to expect treachery. This moment demanded they expect cooperation. The lieutenant's decision to lie about reinforcements was, paradoxically, an act of honesty. He understood that the captain needed a reason to believe his men would be safe, and that reason had to sound concrete, official, and inevitable. The truth, that they were alone and improvising, would have destroyed the fragile trust required for the surrender to hold. So he constructed a fiction that served a deeper truth. The Americans would protect these prisoners, not because they had overwhelming force, but because they had made a promise. And the captain, for his part, chose to believe, not because he was naive, but because belief was the only path forward. His men were starving, sick, and isolated. Continued resistance meant slow death in the mountains. Retreat meant being hunted by guerrillas. Surrender to Chinese forces meant execution. The Americans represented the only scenario where survival was possible, even if it meant trusting a lieutenant he just met in a language he didn't speak, backed by a force that didn't exist. This is how wars end in the field, not with grand ceremonies aboard battleships, but with exhausted men on both sides deciding that survival is worth more than pride, that trust is a gamble worth taking, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is lay down your weapon and hope the other side honors the rules you've both been violating for years. There's a moment in every surrender, every ceasefire, every armistice, where the shooting could start again. It's the moment when one side is disarmed but not yet secured, when control is theoretical but not yet physical, when the decision to cooperate is still reversible. In that courtyard, that moment lasted for hours. Over 100 armed men could have decided, collectively or individually, that surrender was a mistake. The Marines, outnumbered and exhausted, couldn't have stopped them. The only thing preventing a massacre, in either direction, was a mutual agreement that the war was over. But the war wasn't over in any official sense that would have held up in a court-martial. There was no signed document, no authority higher than a lieutenant making promises he had no power to enforce, no physical security, just an invisible line drawn by shared understanding, held in place by fear of the alternative. The Japanese captain understood this. He kept his men in formation, motionless and silent, not because he was afraid of the Marines, but because he was afraid of his own men. Some of them, the younger ones, the ones who still believed in victory or death, might have broken ranks if given the opportunity, might have reached for their weapons, might have decided that dying with a rifle in hand was preferable to the uncertainty of captivity. The captain maintained order through sheer force of will and the cultural weight of obedience that had been drilled into these soldiers since childhood. He had made a decision, and they would follow it, not because they agreed, but because that's what discipline meant. The Marines, meanwhile, had to project confidence they didn't feel. They couldn't show doubt, couldn't show fear, couldn't let the prisoners see that they were improvising every minute, hoping the radio would work, hoping the convoy would arrive, hoping that nobody on either side would do something stupid that would shatter the fragile peace they'd constructed. Leadership in that moment wasn't about strategy or tactics. It was about performance, convincing everyone, including themselves, that they were in control. This encounter is almost never mentioned in histories of the Pacific War. It doesn't appear in major documentaries. It's not taught in military academies as an example of anything in particular. It's too small, too strange, too dependent on luck and personality to be instructive. But it's representative of thousands of similar moments that occurred across Asia in August and September 1945, when the war was officially over but practically still in motion, when units scattered across a continent tried to figure out what surrender actually meant. In China alone, over 1 million Japanese soldiers were stranded when the war ended. They were spread across hundreds of garrisons, outposts, and regional commands, each with varying levels of communication with Tokyo, varying degrees of loyalty to the command structure, and varying interpretations of what the emperor's surrender declaration required them to do. Some surrendered immediately to nationalist forces. Others refused to surrender until American officers arrived. A few continued fighting, either because they didn't believe the surrender was real or because they had been cut off so long they never received the message. The process of disarmament took months. It was messy, chaotic, and occasionally violent. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed after the surrender, not in combat, but in the confused aftermath when local forces took revenge or disagreements over custody turned deadly. The Marines in China were there to manage this chaos, but they were never given enough men, enough resources, or enough clear guidance to do it effectively. They were referees in a civil war, peacekeepers in a country that didn't want peace, and custodians of prisoners that nobody else wanted to take responsibility for. The fact that most of these handovers occurred without major bloodshed is a testament to the improvisation and restraint of men on the ground, who understood that following the rules to the letter would get everyone killed. The lieutenant never spoke publicly about what happened in that courtyard. In the few interviews he gave later in life, he deflected questions about the surrender, describing it as routine, uneventful, and not worth discussing. But those who served with him said he carried the memory differently. He understood that he had been given an impossible responsibility, the safety of both his men and the prisoners, and that any mistake, any misjudgment, could have ended in massacre. He had lied to make the surrender work, and that lie had saved lives. But it had also violated the one principle he believed in, that you don't make promises you can't keep. The paradox is that the lie became true. He promised reinforcements would arrive, and they did. He promised the prisoners would be protected, and they were. He promised that the surrender would be honored, and it was. The fiction he created became reality because everyone involved chose to act as if it already was. That's not how military operations are supposed to work. But it's how most human interactions work, especially in moments of crisis. We construct shared narratives, agree to believe them, and hope they hold long enough for reality to catch up. The Japanese captain carried his own weight. He had defied other officers to make the surrender happen. He had used force, or the threat of force, to impose his will on men who might have preferred death. He had gambled his men's lives on the word of an enemy he'd never met, in a language he didn't speak, based on a promise that sounded too good to be true. And when the promise was kept, when the Americans honored the surrender and protected the prisoners from Chinese forces, he was vindicated. But vindication doesn't erase doubt. For the rest of his life, he would wonder what would have happened if the radio had failed, if the convoy hadn't arrived, if the lieutenant had been lying not just strategically, but maliciously. He would wonder if his decision to trust had been wisdom or luck. Both men had made choices that defied training, contradicted doctrine, and relied entirely on reading the other person correctly in a span of minutes. They had each held the power to destroy the other, and each had chosen not to. That's not heroism in the conventional sense. It's something quieter, something harder to define. It's the recognition that in the space between war and peace, between enemy and prisoner, between threat and trust, there's room for decisions that save lives precisely because they ignore the rules designed to take them. The story of 22 Marines capturing 120 prisoners became a footnote, a curiosity, a bar story told by veterans who couldn't quite believe it themselves. It wasn't included in official histories because it didn't fit the narrative. The Pacific War was supposed to be brutal, uncompromising, and defined by the refusal of Japanese forces to surrender. This story suggested something more complex. It suggested that surrender was always an option, but only under specific conditions, with specific people, in specific moments where fear and hope balanced in a way that made cooperation possible. It also revealed the limits of doctrine. The Marine Corps had trained these men to fight, to kill efficiently, to take ground and hold it against overwhelming odds, but they hadn't trained them to negotiate with an armed enemy force from a position of weakness, to bluff their way through a surrender, or to hold prisoners they couldn't secure. The lieutenant had to invent a solution in real time, drawing on instincts that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with human psychology. This is the part of war that doesn't make it into the manuals. The improvisation. The moment when everything you've been taught is irrelevant and you have to figure out what to do based on nothing more than your ability to read a room, assess risk, and decide whether the person across from you is someone you can trust for the next 6 hours. Most of war is not climactic battles or grand strategy. Most of war is moments like this, where the wrong word or the wrong gesture could restart the killing, and the only thing preventing it is the mutual exhaustion of men who are tired of being afraid. When the convoy disappeared over the ridge, the courtyard fell silent. The Marines sat down. They didn't celebrate. They didn't talk much. They just sat, feeling the adrenaline drain away, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that had nothing to do with physical exertion. They had spent 6 hours in a state of hyper-awareness, watching for threats, ready to react, holding a position that shouldn't have been holdable. And now it was over, and the only thing left was the strange, hollow feeling that comes after you survive something that should have killed you. This content is only supported in a Larkdocs. One of the Marines, the corporal from Tennessee, asked the lieutenant if he'd really thought the reinforcements would arrive in time. The lieutenant said yes. The corporal didn't believe him. Neither did anyone else. But they didn't push it. Because the truth, the real truth, was that it didn't matter whether the lieutenant had believed it or not. What mattered was that he'd convinced the Japanese captain to believe it, and that belief had held long enough for the lie to become truth. That's the lesson, if there is one. Not that you should lie to your enemies, but that you should understand what your enemies need to believe in order to stop being your enemies. The Japanese captain needed to believe his men would be safe. The lieutenant gave him that belief. It was a gift, a fiction, a gamble, and a promise all at once. And it worked because both men understood that the alternative, the truth that they were alone and unprotected and one misunderstanding away from mutual slaughter, was too dangerous to acknowledge. War ends not with clarity, but with ambiguity, with exhausted men making decisions based on incomplete information and hoping they guessed right, with enemies who stop being enemies not because they've been defeated, but because they've been given a reason to believe that stopping is survivable, with leaders who lie, bluff, and improvise their way through situations that should be impossible and come out the other side wondering how the hell they're still alive. 22 Marines walked into a courtyard full of armed enemy soldiers and walked out with 120 prisoners. No shots fired, no casualties, no grand strategy. Just a lieutenant who understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth, and a captain who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe a lie. If you want to understand how wars really end, this is where you start.